The morning Marcus Webb died his second death, the sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern ridge of the Absaroka Range. November of 1827 had already proven itself the coldest in living memory, and that morning carried a particular quality of silence that old trappers knew meant only one thing: something was watching. Marcus had been checking his line of beaver traps along Soda Butte Creek for 3 days, working his way upstream through country so remote that even the crow considered it the edge of the known world. His breath hung in clouds that seemed to freeze before they could disperse. The creek itself ran black and sluggish, rimmed with ice that grew thicker each night, and the aspens along its banks stood bare and white as bones bleaching in the sun. He was kneeling at his 7th trap, working the frozen mechanism free with hands that had long ago lost all feeling, when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of sound. The whisper of wind through the pines had stopped. The creek's gentle murmur seemed muffled, distant, and in that vacuum of silence, Marcus's survival instinct, honed by 14 years in the mountains, began screaming at him to move. He looked up slowly, his .54 caliber Hawken rifle lying against a fallen log 10 feet away, and saw them. 6 Blackfoot warriors, painted for war, spread in a semicircle 30 yards distant. They had been tracking him for hours, waiting for precisely this moment when his hands were occupied, his weapon out of reach, and the terrain offered no cover. The lead warrior, a man Marcus recognized from a trading post altercation 2 summers prior, wore a necklace of what looked like finger bones and carried a trade musket. The others had bows, already knocked with arrows that could punch through a man's rib cage at this range. Marcus knew the calculus of his death with mathematical precision. Even if he reached his rifle, the standard loading process would take at minimum 45 seconds. Pour powder from horn into measure, dump powder down barrel, retrieve patched ball from possible bag, ram ball down barrel with hickory rod, prime the pan, cock the hammer, aim, fire. 45 seconds in which 6 warriors would cover 30 yards and put enough arrows in him to turn his body into a pincushion. The mountain men had a saying: 1 shot, 1 kill, then run like hell or die like a fool. Because that second shot simply wasn't available when you needed it. Marcus had done everything right that morning. He had followed every rule written in blood and carved into the consciousness of every man who worked the beaver streams. He had carried the finest rifle that money could buy, a Hawken that Jake and Sam Hawken themselves had built in their St. Louis shop, with a barrel true enough to drop a elk at 200 yards. He had kept his powder dry in a brass-capped horn, his balls perfectly cast and patched with greased linen for accuracy. His loading procedure was textbook, the exact method passed down from Pennsylvania long riflesmiths and refined through generations. He could load and fire in 45 seconds, which was considered good time, respectable time, the mark of a competent frontiersman. But 45 seconds might as well have been 45 minutes when 6 warriors were charging your position. The standard method wasn't just inefficient. In moments like these, it was a suicide pact, written in gunpowder and lead. Every trapper knew men who had died with their ramrods still in their barrels, frantically trying to seat a ball while a grizzly closed the distance or hostiles rushed their position. The wilderness didn't care about textbook procedures. It cared about survival, and survival demanded speed. Yet the rifle, for all its accuracy and power, remained a weapon of patience, a weapon that gave you one chance, one perfectly aimed shot, and then transformed into little more than an awkward club for the 45 seconds it took to make it lethal again. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, even in that moment of crystallized terror. The rifle had made white men dominant in open country, had shifted the balance of power across the frontier, had turned farmers into soldiers and trappers into legends. But it had also chained them to a loading process so slow, so deliberate, that any miscalculation of distance or timing could prove instantly fatal. The problem went deeper than just the time involved. It was the complexity, the number of separate actions required, each dependent on the one before, each vulnerable to fumbling or failure. In the cold, fingers didn't work right. Powder could clump, patches could tear, the ramrod could stick, and every second spent looking down at your hands was a second you weren't watching the threat, weren't repositioning, weren't making the 100 tiny adjustments that kept you alive. Other trappers had tried shortcuts. Some carried 2 or even 3 rifles, which meant 3 times the weight and 3 weapons to keep dry and maintained. Some carried pistols as backup, but pistols lacked range and stopping power. Some had tried to learn the bow, but European hands never quite mastered the instinctive aim that native warriors learned from childhood. Every solution created its own problems, its own vulnerabilities. The rifle remained supreme for that first shot, but after that first shot, you were just another man with a stick, praying that one shot had been enough. Marcus stayed kneeling at the trap, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who understands that sudden movement means death. The lead warrior said something in Blackfoot, probably an insult or perhaps an explanation of what they were about to do to him, and the semicircle began to tighten. This was it then. This was how it would end. Not in some heroic last stand, but kneeling at a beaver trap with numb fingers, too far from his rifle, too slow to matter. But even as that thought crystallized, even as the warriors closed to 25 yards, something else was happening in Marcus's mind. A memory, or rather a series of memories, clicking together like the mechanism of a well-made lock. Images and observations that he had been collecting for months, maybe years, without fully understanding what they meant or why they mattered. The problem wasn't actually the rifle. The problem was everything else. The Hawken in his hands was mechanically perfect, a masterpiece of American gunsmithing. The issue lay in the dance around it, the ritual of loading that had ossified into dogma simply because it was the way things had always been done. But what if the ritual itself was wrong? What if generations of riflemen had been performing a procedure that made sense for target shooting, for hunting elk from a stand, for situations where time was abundant and accuracy was paramount, but made no sense at all for the reality of close-quarters combat in the wilderness? Marcus had spent a cold February evening 6 months earlier in a trading post on the Yellowstone, drinking whiskey that tasted like kerosene and listening to an old French voyageur named Baptiste tell stories. Baptiste had been in the mountains since before Lewis and Clark, had seen things and done things that made even seasoned trappers shake their heads in disbelief. That night, Baptiste had described watching a Métis buffalo runner during a hunt on the Canadian plains, a man who could fire, reload, and fire again while riding at full gallop. Baptiste had been drunk, and his description was fragmented, but one detail stuck in Marcus's mind. The hunter hadn't used a ramrod. Somehow, impossibly, he had loaded the rifle without ever touching the ramrod. Marcus had dismissed it at the time as either exaggeration or Baptiste's whiskey-soaked imagination. But the image had lodged somewhere in the back of his consciousness, and, over the following months, other observations had accumulated around it. He had noticed that when he was shooting from horseback, the ball would sometimes seat itself from just the recoil and the angle, without needing to be rammed. He had seen a young trapper named Wilson panic during a grizzly encounter and dump everything down the barrel at once, powder and ball together, and somehow the rifle had still fired. He had watched Crow warriors loading trade muskets with a speed that seemed impossible, and realized they were using techniques different from the white man's careful, measured approach. All of these observations had been peripheral, disconnected, filed away as curiosities rather than revelations. But now, with death closing in at 20 yards, those fragments assembled themselves into a coherent whole. The revelation was simple, almost stupidly so. He didn't need to patch the ball. He didn't need to measure the powder. He didn't need to use the ramrod. Everything that made loading slow and precise was actually unnecessary for close-range combat, where speed mattered more than pinpoint accuracy, a smaller ball that could drop freely down the barrel. Powder pre-measured and carried in a way that could be dumped instantly, loading entirely by gravity and momentum rather than ramming. It was heretical. It violated every principle of marksmanship that Marcus had been taught. It would sacrifice accuracy, reduce range, potentially even be dangerous if the ball didn't seat properly against the powder. But it might, just possibly, cut the loading time from 45 seconds to something close to 10. The idea had been brewing in his subconscious for weeks. He had been experimenting quietly in ways that he hadn't even admitted to himself. He had cast a dozen balls that were slightly undersized, 530 instead of the standard 535, allowing them to drop freely down the bore without patching. He had made paper cartridges, twisting powder charges in torn pages from an old Bible, exactly the way soldiers in the regular army did, but with carefully measured amounts perfect for his rifle. He had practiced a motion, fluid and continuous, that involved biting open the cartridge, dumping powder, dropping the naked ball, striking the butt of the rifle against the ground to seat everything, priming and firing. In his camp, alone, he had managed it in 12 seconds, but he had never tried it under pressure, never tested it when his life actually depended on it, never even told anyone about it because he knew exactly what they would say. 2 months earlier, at a rendezvous on the Green River, Marcus had mentioned something to another trapper, a leathery Kentuckian named Silas, who had been in the mountains even longer than Marcus. Marcus hadn't explained the full system, just mentioned the idea of carrying undersized balls for faster loading in emergencies. Silas had looked at him like he had suggested using pine cones for ammunition. "Might as well spit at them," Silas had said, then turned to the other men around the fire and announced, "Webb here wants to shoot undersized balls. Next thing, he'll be loading his rifle from the muzzle end while riding backwards on a buffalo." The laughter had been long and loud, and Marcus hadn't brought it up again. The conventional wisdom was absolute. Patched balls for accuracy, carefully measured powder for consistency, methodical loading for reliability. Anything else was the mark of either a greenhorn who didn't know better or a fool who thought he knew more than generations of experienced riflemen. But conventional wisdom assumed you had time. It assumed the luxury of preparation, of careful aim, of the measured deliberation that turned shooting into an art form. It didn't account for moments like this when 6 warriors were 15 yards away and closing fast, and conventional wisdom was just another word for dying slowly while following the rules. Marcus made his decision. Not consciously, not through rational calculation, but through the kind of instant certainty that comes when observation, experience, and desperation crystallize into action. His right hand moved to the pocket he had sewn into his hunting shirt, the one where he kept a dozen paper cartridges. His left hand swept the rifle up from the log even as he lunged sideways, creating distance and angle, moving into the only piece of cover available. A fallen pine trunk that was more psychological comfort than actual protection. The warriors exploded into motion, expecting the standard response, the fumbling 45-second death spiral. The lead warrior raised his musket, but didn't fire, wanting to close the distance, wanting to take Marcus alive for the prolonged death that would satisfy honor and vengeance. That hesitation bought Marcus 3 seconds. He bit the paper cartridge, tasting the sharp bitterness of gunpowder, and dumped the charge down the barrel while simultaneously dropping the undersized ball after it. The paper cartridge came apart in his mouth, but he didn't care. He slammed the butt of the rifle against a rock with a force that made the stock crack, felt the ball seat against the powder, and in one continuous motion swung the muzzle up while his thumb flicked open the pan and dumped in priming powder from a smaller measure he wore on a cord around his neck. 12 seconds, maybe 10. He didn't have time to aim properly, just point the rifle at the center mass of the lead warrior at 10 yards and pull the trigger. The Hawken roared, smoke obscuring everything. And through the smoke, Marcus saw the warrior go down hard, the musket flying from his hands. But there were still 5 more, now at 8 yards, and the one on the left was drawing his bow. This was the moment. This was where the standard method would have left Marcus dead or dying, frantically pulling out his powder horn while arrows turned him into a human pincushion. Instead, his hands were already moving. Bite cartridge, pour powder, drop ball, slam butt, prime pan. The motions felt mechanical, divorced from conscious thought, a sequence he had practiced, until it had become something like muscle memory. The rifle came up again, and Marcus fired without really aiming, just pointing at the warrior with the drawn bow, 7 yards now. The ball caught him somewhere in the torso, spun him sideways, and suddenly the arithmetic of the engagement had changed. 6 warriors had become 4 effective fighters, and they had closed from 30 yards to 5, while Marcus had fired twice. But he had fired twice, which should have been impossible, which violated every assumption about what a lone rifleman could do. The remaining warriors hesitated just for a moment, confused by what they had just witnessed. That hesitation was survival. Marcus's hands moved through the sequence again: bite, pour, drop, slam, prime. His fingers were shaking now, adrenaline flooding his system, making the fine motor control difficult. The third cartridge was harder to tear open, and he felt powder spill across his chest, wasting charge. But there was no time to be careful. He got enough powder into the barrel, dropped the ball, slammed the butt again, and brought the rifle up just as 2 warriors rushed him simultaneously from different angles. 10 seconds, maybe less. He fired at the one on the right, saw him stumble, knew it wasn't a killing shot, but it was enough to take him out of the immediate fight. 3 effective warriors left, now at arm's length, and Marcus had no time for another reload. He reversed the rifle, using it as a club, felt the stock connect with something solid, heard bone crack. A knife flashed, and Marcus felt pain lance across his forearm, but he had the barrel in both hands now, swinging it like a quarterstaff, creating space, buying seconds. And then, unexpectedly, miraculously, they broke. The 3 remaining warriors pulled back, grabbed their wounded companions, and melted into the trees with the fluid efficiency of men who knew when to retreat. Marcus stood there, bleeding, shaking, surrounded by powder smoke and the echo of gunfire bouncing off the ridgeline. He had fired 3 shots in somewhere close to 25 or 30 seconds total, had hit 3 targets at ranges where missing was almost impossible, and had survived an encounter that should have left him dead in the first 10 seconds. The silence returned, deeper now, pressed down by the weight of what had just happened. Marcus looked down at his rifle, at the cracked stock where he had been slamming it against the rock, at his torn cartridge pocket, at the blood running down his arm from the knife wound. He looked at the creek, still running black and cold, and at the beaver trap, still holding its catch, and at the world that had just proven itself slightly more negotiable than conventional wisdom allowed. 3 shots in approximately 30 seconds, total. Not 3 shots in 10 seconds exactly, as the rapid sequence had actually taken longer in total time, but 3 combat-effective shots in a span where conventional loading would have given him barely enough time to reload once, maybe not even that. The Blackfoot warriors would report back to their band about the trapper who could shoot without reloading, who violated the known rules of rifle combat, who had turned the equation of superiority on its head. Marcus sat down heavily, his back against the log, and began the process of properly reloading his rifle with patched ball and measured powder, because accuracy mattered again now that the immediate crisis had passed. His hands were still shaking, making it difficult, and the knife wound needed attention before infection set in. But he was alive, which was more than he had any right to expect 10 minutes earlier. He had violated every principle of proper marksmanship, had used undersized balls that couldn't possibly be accurate, had slammed his rifle against rocks in a way that made gunsmiths weep, had loaded without ramrods or patches or any of the careful procedures that separated civilized shooting from desperate fumbling, and none of it mattered, because none of those people trying to maintain their careful procedures were being charged by 6 Blackfoot warriors. In that moment, speed had mattered more than accuracy, survival had mattered more than technique, and breaking the rules had mattered more than following them. The walk back to his camp took most of the day, carrying both the rifle and the beaver pelts he had managed to collect before the ambush. His arm throbbed with each step, and he knew he would need to burn out the wound with a hot knife to prevent infection. But his mind wasn't on pain. It was on what he had discovered, on the system he had proven, on the implications of what had just happened. The paper cartridge method wasn't new. Military forces had been using cartridges for decades, maybe longer. But they used them with ramrods, with the full loading procedure, simply speeding up one step of many. What Marcus had stumbled upon was the elimination of steps, the realization that for close-range combat, half of the loading procedure was simply waste motion. The undersized ball was the key. It allowed gravity to do the work of ramming, allowed the rifle to be loaded in one continuous downward motion rather than a complex sequence of separate actions. The risk, of course, was that an undersized ball would lose accuracy at anything beyond 30 yards, would lose power because it didn't seal the bore properly, would potentially even fail to fire if the ball didn't seat against the powder consistently. But Marcus had just fired 3 effective shots at ranges from 10 yards down to 5, and all 3 had struck close enough to center mass to take warriors out of the fight. At those ranges, the accuracy loss didn't matter. The slight reduction in power didn't matter. What mattered was rate of fire, was the ability to get a second and third shot downrange, while the enemy was still closing distance, was turning the rifle from a one-shot weapon into something that approached the sustained fire capability of a bow. In close combat, in the thick brush along beaver streams, in the sudden encounters that characterized mountain life, Marcus's system was superior, not marginally better, but categorically different, a fundamental shift in capability that changed the tactical equation. That evening, back at his camp, Marcus sat by his fire and worked through the implications. The system wasn't perfect. It required preparation, required making cartridges in advance, required carrying slightly specialized ammunition. It was messy, with powder spilling and paper fragments littering everything. It sacrificed long-range precision for short-range speed. It was harder on the rifle, with the stock slamming likely to crack the wood eventually. But it was teachable, reproducible, adaptable. Any trapper could learn it. Any rifle could use it. All it required was the willingness to question the standard method, to recognize that different situations demanded different solutions, and to accept that the conventional wisdom of target shooting didn't necessarily translate to survival shooting. Marcus spent the winter of 1827-1828 refining the system, experimenting with different approaches, trying to find the optimal balance between speed and reliability. He discovered that the ball didn't need to be much undersized, that even a difference of 0.005 of an inch was enough to allow gravity loading. He found that using slightly heavier powder charges compensated for the power loss from the looser ball fit. He learned to make cartridges more carefully, twisting the paper tighter so they wouldn't come apart prematurely. He practiced the motions until they became automatic, until he could load and fire 3 times in less than 30 seconds, reliably, even in the dark, even with cold fingers. By spring, when the ice broke and the beaver began moving again, Marcus had transformed his discovery into a system. The real test came not in combat, but in teaching. At the 1828 rendezvous on the Popo Agi, Marcus demonstrated his rapid loading technique to a group of trappers, including Silas, the Kentuckian who had mocked him the year before. Marcus set up a simple demonstration, 3 targets, pine boards propped against trees at 10, 15, and 20 yards. Using the standard loading method, Marcus fired, reloaded carefully with patched ball and measured powder, and fired again. 2 shots in 90 seconds, both dead center on their targets. Beautiful shooting, textbook execution, the kind of marksmanship that won prizes at turkey shoots back in the settlements. Then he switched to his rapid loading system. He fired 3 shots in 35 seconds, hitting all 3 targets off-center but well within the kill zone for a man-sized target. The difference in accuracy was noticeable. The difference in speed was revolutionary. Silas stood there, chewing tobacco, studying the targets. Finally he spat and said, "Well, I'll be a son of a bitch. That's the stupidest smart thing I ever saw." Which was about as close to approval as Silas ever came. Other trappers crowded around, asking questions, skeptical but interested. How much accuracy did you lose? How reliable was it? Did it damage the rifle? Would it work in rain? Could you do it on horseback? Marcus answered what he could, demonstrated again, let others try it with their own rifles. Some dismissed it as a trick, a desperate measure that sacrificed too much precision. Others saw immediately what Marcus had seen, that in the specific circumstances where you needed a second shot quickly, precision was a luxury you couldn't afford anyway. The technique spread slowly, unevenly, the way all practical knowledge spread on the frontier, not through formal instruction or written manuals, but through demonstration and story, through one trapper showing another, through tales told around campfires and at trading posts. Some men adopted it fully, making cartridges part of their standard kit. Others learned it, but only used it as an emergency backup, still preferring traditional loading for normal hunting. A few modified it, adding their own innovations, finding different ways to achieve the same essential goal of eliminating unnecessary steps from the loading sequence. By 1830, the rapid loading system was common enough that it had acquired a name of sorts. Trappers called it mountain loading, or emergency loading, or sometimes just Webb's foolishness, depending on who was talking and how much respect they had for speed versus accuracy. What Marcus had discovered, though he didn't think of it in these terms, was the principle of task analysis. He had broken down the loading procedure into its component steps and asked a fundamental question about each one. Is this necessary for the specific purpose I'm trying to achieve? For target shooting or long-range hunting, the answer was yes to everything. Patched balls were necessary for accuracy. Measured powder was necessary for consistency. Careful ramming was necessary for proper seating. But for close-range defensive shooting, where the enemy was 10 yards away and closing fast, many of those steps were unnecessary. They were cargo cult rituals, actions performed because they had always been performed, not because they served the immediate purpose. By eliminating the unnecessary and streamlining the necessary, Marcus had cut the loading time by 2/3. The principle extended beyond just rifle loading. It was a way of thinking about survival in the wilderness, a recognition that techniques developed in one context might not be optimal in another, that traditions could become traps if you couldn't distinguish between their essential and superfluous elements. The Pennsylvania long rifle had been designed for accuracy at long range, for shooting squirrels out of tall trees and hitting deer at distances that made other firearms useless. It was a masterpiece of precision engineering, and the loading procedures that had grown up around it were designed to maximize that precision. But the Rocky Mountain wilderness wasn't Pennsylvania. Encounters were often at close range, in thick cover, against multiple opponents. The tactical situation was fundamentally different, and tactics that made sense in Pennsylvania became liabilities in the Rockies. Marcus survived his encounter with the Blackfoot warriors by recognizing this mismatch and adapting his technique to the actual situation he faced rather than the idealized situation his training had assumed. That ability to adapt, to question, to observe what actually worked rather than what should work in theory, became his true legacy. The specific technique of rapid loading was useful, perhaps even revolutionary in its context. But the mindset behind it, the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and experiment with alternatives, was transformative. It represented a shift from received knowledge to empirical knowledge, from "this is how it's always been done" to "let me test if there's a better way." Over the following years, as Marcus continued to trap and trade in the mountains, he became known not just for his rapid loading technique, but for his general approach to problem solving. When other trappers complained about beaver traps freezing solid in winter, Marcus experimented with different trigger mechanisms until he found one that worked reliably even in extreme cold. When horses died from eating toxic plants on new ranges, Marcus spent weeks observing which plants they avoided naturally and which ones they ate, developing a practical guide to safe grazing areas. When river crossings became treacherous during spring runoff, Marcus studied how native peoples chose their crossing points and adapted their techniques. Each solution followed the same pattern. Observe carefully, question assumptions, experiment methodically, share what works. The 1832 rendezvous brought together more trappers than any previous gathering, several hundred men converging on Pierre's Hole for trading and carousing. Marcus, now in his early 40s and considered an old-timer by mountain standards, found himself surrounded by younger trappers eager for stories and advice. He demonstrated his rapid loading technique again, now refined to the point where he could reliably get 3 shots off in 25 seconds, and found that many of the younger men had already learned it from others who had learned it from him. The technique had evolved as it spread, with different trappers adding their own refinements. Some used leather cartridge boxes instead of Marcus's sewn pockets. Some pre-measured their powder into horn sections for even faster access. One innovative Frenchman had even figured out how to reload while running, something Marcus had never managed. The technique had taken on a life of its own, had become part of the common knowledge base of mountain men, one tool among many in the survival toolkit. But the most interesting conversation Marcus had that rendezvous was with a young Army lieutenant named Carson, fresh from West Point and assigned to escort duty on the frontier. Carson had heard about the rapid loading technique and was curious whether it could be adapted for military use. He peppered Marcus with questions about reliability, about training time, about whether the technique could be taught to soldiers who might not have the individual initiative of trappers. Marcus was honest about the limitations. The technique required quality firearms. Smooth-bore muskets wouldn't benefit much from it. It required intelligence and adaptability. Soldiers drilled in rote procedures might struggle with the judgment calls about when to use standard loading versus rapid loading. And it was inherently messier, louder, and less parade ground perfect than conventional military procedures. But for small unit actions, for scouts and skirmishers, for any situation where speed mattered more than volley fire, it could be transformative. Carson took notes, sketched diagrams, and promised to file a report with his commanding officer. Marcus never learned whether anything came of it, whether the Army ever adopted or even tested the rapid loading technique. Military institutions moved slowly, valued standardization over innovation, and were generally skeptical of techniques developed by irregular frontiersmen rather than trained military theorists. But the conversation stayed with Marcus, because it highlighted the broader issue of how knowledge was transferred, validated, and institutionalized. A trapper could adopt a new technique immediately, if it worked, could spread it through demonstration and practical proof. An institution required documentation, formal testing, approval through chains of command. The trapper's method was faster but chaotic, spreading unevenly and sometimes losing crucial details in transmission. The institutional method was slower but systematic, ensuring that once a technique was adopted, it would be taught consistently and correctly. Neither method was inherently superior. They served different purposes, operated under different constraints. But Marcus came away from that conversation with a deeper appreciation for how fragile knowledge was, how easily techniques could be lost if they weren't passed down carefully, if they weren't documented or taught or remembered. The rapid loading technique survived because it was useful, because it solved a real problem that trappers faced regularly, because men who learned it wanted to teach it to others. But Marcus had seen other innovations disappear, clever solutions to specific problems that died with the men who invented them, because they never found a wider audience or because circumstances changed and they were no longer needed. By the late 1830s, as beaver populations declined and the fur trade began its slow collapse, Marcus found himself thinking more about legacy, about what would survive of the mountain man culture once the economic basis for it disappeared. The rapid loading technique would survive because it had already spread beyond him, had been adopted and adapted by hundreds of men who would carry it with them wherever they went. But other knowledge, other tricks and techniques and hard-won wisdom risked being lost. Marcus began talking to younger trappers more deliberately, telling stories not just for entertainment, but for education, trying to pass on not just specific techniques, but the mindset that generated them. The essential lesson wasn't about rifle loading, it was about observation, about paying attention to what actually happened rather than what you expected to happen, about questioning whether traditional methods were truly optimal or just traditional, about being willing to experiment, to look foolish, to be wrong in pursuit of being eventually right. The rapid loading technique had emerged because Marcus had observed that balls sometimes seated themselves without ramming, had noticed that mounted warriors loaded faster than dismounted ones, had listened to an old French trapper's drunken story and wondered if there might be truth in it. None of those observations by themselves meant much. But combined, cross-referenced, tested through experiment, they had revealed something new. This pattern repeated throughout frontier history. The men who thrived, who survived decades in conditions that killed most newcomers within years, were the ones who could observe, adapt, and innovate. They learned from natives, borrowed from different European traditions, experimented with new approaches, and synthesized knowledge from multiple sources. They weren't necessarily smarter or stronger than those who died, but they were more flexible, more willing to question their own assumptions, more capable of recognizing when circumstances demanded new solutions. The frontier selected for cognitive flexibility, for the ability to look at a problem from multiple angles and synthesize novel solutions rather than simply applying learned procedures. Marcus's rapid loading technique was one small example of this broader pattern, a technique that emerged from observation and experimentation, that challenged conventional wisdom, that proved itself through practical testing, and that spread through the frontier community because it solved a real problem. It wasn't the only such technique, wasn't even the most important in the grand scheme of things, but it represented a way of thinking, an approach to knowledge and survival that characterized the best of frontier culture, the willingness to question, to observe, to experiment, to share what worked and learn from others' experiments. By 1840, Marcus had left the mountains, had taken his accumulated wages and beaver pelts, and invested them in a small farm near Independence, Missouri, where he could watch the wagon trains forming up for the trek west. He was in his late 40s, old for a mountain man, and his body carried the accumulated damage of 2 decades in the wilderness, frost-damaged fingers that ached in cold weather, a knife scar across his forearm from the Blackfoot encounter, joints that protested every morning. But his mind was sharp, and he found purpose in talking to emigrants, to the farmers and merchants and families heading west to Oregon or California, passing on what wisdom he could about survival in unfamiliar country. He told them about the rapid loading technique, demonstrated it when they asked, but he spent more time talking about the principle behind it. Watch carefully, he told them. The West isn't like the East. and what worked back home might get you killed out there. Learn from the people who are already there, native or white. Experiment. Be willing to look foolish. Question whether you're doing things a certain way because it's the best way or just because it's the way you were taught. Combine knowledge from different sources. Test your assumptions before your life depends on them. Some listened. Most nodded politely and moved on, confident that the knowledge they brought from the East would be sufficient, that the techniques that had worked in Ohio or Kentucky would work just fine in the Rockies or the desert. And many of them died, or suffered unnecessarily, or barely survived when they should have thrived. But some listened, really listened, and took the lesson to heart. Those were the ones who adapted, who observed, who questioned, who innovated, who recognized that survival in new circumstances required cognitive flexibility, required the willingness to question and adapt and synthesize. The rapid loading technique itself gradually became obsolete. By the 1850s, new rifle designs were emerging, breech-loading mechanisms that allowed genuinely rapid fire without any tricks or shortcuts. The percussion cap replaced the flintlock, making ignition more reliable. Metallic cartridges eliminated the need for paper cartridges and loose powder. Each innovation made the rifle faster to load, more reliable, more powerful. By the time of the Civil War, a soldier with a Spencer repeating rifle could fire 7 shots in 15 seconds, making Marcus's 3 shots in 30 seconds seem positively leisurely. Technology had solved through engineering the problem that Marcus had solved through technique. But the principle remained. The observation that conventional wisdom might not be optimal for specific circumstances. The recognition that emergency situations required different approaches than ideal situations. The willingness to experiment, to question, to synthesize knowledge from multiple sources. These lessons transcended any specific technique, remained relevant regardless of technological advancement. They represented a mindset, a way of approaching problems that was valuable in the 1820s and remained valuable in every subsequent era. Marcus died in 1858, kicked by a horse in his farmyard, a mundane end for a man who had survived grizzly bears, hostile warriors, and every hardship the Rocky Mountains could offer. His obituary in the local paper was brief, noting that he had been a trapper in the mountains during the fur trade era and had later farmed near Independence. It didn't mention the rapid loading technique, didn't talk about innovation or experimentation or the synthesis of knowledge. History rarely preserves the details of practical technique, rarely recognizes the importance of small innovations that spread through informal channels rather than formal institutions. But the technique survived, at least in the oral tradition of mountain men and frontiersmen, passed down through stories and demonstrations, evolving and adapting as it spread. Old trappers would tell young scouts about the man who figured out how to load a rifle without a ramrod, about the desperate battle where 3 quick shots turned the tide, about the importance of questioning conventional wisdom and observing carefully and being willing to look foolish in pursuit of staying alive. The details became murkier with each retelling, the specifics lost or embellished. But the core lesson remained intact, was rediscovered independently by others who faced similar circumstances and asked similar questions. The story of Marcus Webb and his rapid loading technique wasn't ultimately about rifle tactics. It was about the process of innovation itself, about how practical knowledge emerges from careful observation, how it spreads through demonstration and teaching, how it evolves as different people adapt it to their specific needs. It was about the importance of questioning received wisdom, about recognizing when established procedures were designed for different circumstances than those you currently faced. It was about the cognitive flexibility required for survival in uncertain environments, the ability to synthesize knowledge from multiple sources rather than relying on any single tradition. These lessons extended far beyond the frontier, far beyond the specific circumstance of rifle loading in the Rocky Mountains during the 1820s. They represented universal principles of problem-solving and adaptation. When you face a new challenge, observe carefully before acting. Question whether established procedures are truly optimal or just established. Look for solutions in unexpected places. Combine knowledge from different domains. Test your theories before betting your life on them. Share what you learn so others can build on your work. These principles served Marcus well in the wilderness. They served the broader community of trappers and frontiersmen well as they explored and settled new territory. And they continue to serve anyone who faces uncertain circumstances and must develop novel solutions to unprecedented challenges. The frontier was, among other things, a laboratory for testing different approaches to problem solving. It selected ruthlessly for techniques that worked and eliminated those that didn't. Men who could observe, adapt, and innovate tended to survive and prosper. Men who couldn't, didn't. Over time, this selection process created a body of practical knowledge, a collection of techniques and approaches that represented the distilled wisdom of thousands of individual experiments, successful and failed. The rapid loading technique was one small part of this knowledge base, one thread in the larger tapestry of frontier survival wisdom. What made Marcus's contribution significant wasn't that he invented something entirely new. The components of his technique, paper cartridges and undersized balls and gravity loading, all existed independently. What Marcus did was recognize that these components could be combined in a specific way to solve a specific problem, that the conventional approach to rifle loading was optimized for the wrong circumstances, and that a different approach was possible and superior for a close-range defensive shooting. He didn't invent new technology. He recombined existing elements in a novel way, driven by careful observation and guided by the principle of eliminating unnecessary steps. This pattern of recombination and simplification, of questioning which steps were truly necessary and which were merely traditional, characterized much of frontier innovation. Water systems that combined native and European techniques, building methods that adapted Eastern designs to Western materials and climate, hunting strategies that borrowed from multiple traditions, navigation techniques that synthesized different cultural knowledge bases. The frontier demanded pragmatism, rewarded effectiveness over orthodoxy, and punished rigid adherence to tradition when circumstances had changed. Those who thrived were those who could recognize these changes and adapt accordingly. As the sun set over his Missouri farm on countless evenings, Marcus would sit on his porch and watch the wagon trains gathering in the distance, preparing for their journey west. He thought about the knowledge they carried with them, the techniques and traditions and assumptions that would guide them in unfamiliar territory. Some of that knowledge would serve them well. Some would prove inadequate or dangerous, and some, like his rapid loading technique, would need to be adapted or entirely reimagined to fit the new circumstances they would face. He hoped they would have the wisdom to recognize the difference, the flexibility to adapt, and the humility to learn from their mistakes. But he knew that many wouldn't, that the lessons of adaptation and innovation would need to be relearned by each generation, paid for in hardship and sometimes in blood. The legacy of the frontier, the real legacy that outlasted the fur trade and the wagon trains and the whole era of westward expansion, wasn't geographic. It wasn't about claiming territory or extracting resources or establishing settlements. The real legacy was cognitive, a set of lessons about how to approach uncertainty, how to solve problems in unfamiliar circumstances, how to observe and question and experiment and synthesize. These lessons, learned and relearned by thousands of individuals facing thousands of specific challenges, represented humanity's accumulated wisdom about adaptation and survival. They were encoded not in formal documents or institutional procedures, but in stories and demonstrations, in techniques, passed from person to person, in the oral tradition that stretched back to the first humans who had to figure out how to survive in unfamiliar territory. Marcus's rapid loading technique was one small story in this larger narrative, one example among thousands of how careful observation and willingness to question conventional wisdom could lead to innovative solutions. It proved that when Silas and the others had scorned his crazy idea, they were applying the wrong standard, judging emergency technique by target shooting criteria. It demonstrated that 3 shots in approximately 30 seconds were possible when the standard method allowed barely 1. And it showed that the difference between survival and death often came down to cognitive flexibility, to the ability to recognize when circumstances demanded novel approaches rather than traditional solutions. The wilderness is gone now, or at least domesticated. The challenges that Marcus faced that required his rapid loading technique and his broader philosophy of observation and adaptation have been replaced by different challenges in different circumstances. But the underlying principles remain valid. Observe carefully. Question assumptions. Recognize when established procedures are optimized for different circumstances than those you face. Combine knowledge from multiple sources. Experiment methodically. Share what you learn. These principles served humans well on the frontier, in the mountains, in every challenging circumstance where survival required more than just following established procedures. They remain the foundation of innovation, of adaptation, of the human capacity to face uncertainty and develop novel solutions. In the end, the story of Marcus Webb and his rapid loading technique isn't primarily about rifles or tactics or frontier violence. It's about the process of learning itself, about how humans figure things out when facing novel challenges, about the importance of questioning and observing and experimenting. It's about the courage required to try something different, to risk looking foolish, to challenge the conventional wisdom even when everyone around you is certain you're wrong. And it's about the satisfaction of being proven right, not through argument or authority, but through the simple test of what works when survival depends on it. The technique itself may be obsolete, rendered unnecessary by technological advancement. But the mindset that created it, the approach to problem-solving and adaptation that it represented, remains as relevant now as it was in the Rocky Mountains of 1827, when a desperate trapper questioned everything he had been taught and discovered that sometimes the fastest path forward requires eliminating half the steps.